Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. I'd always considered myself a city person, so when my girlfriend Maya convinced me to go camping, I was skeptical. She loved the outdoors and promised that a couple of nights in Wildwood Forest would be just the thing to clear our minds. No work, no distractions, she said, a mischievous sparkle in her eye. I agreed, more for her than for myself, but looking back, I wish I hadn't. We set up our tent in a small clearing, with towering pines casting long shadows over our campsite. The forest was dense, the trees standing so close together they blocked out much of the daylight, giving everything a muted, otherworldly feel. As evening approached, a strange chill settled over the woods, and an uneasy silence fell, broken only by the occasional crack of a branch or a rustle of leaves. Just before sundown, we were startled by a voice behind us. "Hey there, folks." We turned to see a park ranger leaning against a tree, watching us. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face, making it difficult to read his expression. His voice was low and gravelly, and something about the way he stood so still and stiff set my nerves on edge. "Name's Ranger Dean," he introduced himself. "I'd recommend you pack up and head back to the main trail. The forest isn't safe after dark." I forced a smile and nodded, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my gut. "Thanks, but we're fine. We'll be careful." He tilted his head, eyes narrowing slightly. "People go missing here," he said, almost a whisper. "Strange things walk these woods, things that don't belong." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows as if he'd never been there at all. Maya laughed it off, calling him the creepiest park ranger ever, and soon we were back to roasting marshmallows over the fire. But his words lingered in my mind, a dark undercurrent beneath the crackle of the flames. That night I woke to a strange sound, low, guttural, almost like an animal growling. I sat up, straining to hear, but all I caught was the faint whisper of pine needles brushing against each other in the wind. I was about to lie back down when I heard it again, closer this time. I reached over and shook Maya awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. She groggily nodded, eyes wide with fear. We sat there holding our breaths as the growl grew louder, closer, until it seemed to circle our tent. And then there was a scratching noise, like claws raking over the fabric. I grabbed the flashlight, my heart pounding, and slowly unzipped the tent. I shone the beam into the darkness, and that's when I saw it. Just beyond the firelight, half hidden among the trees, stood a creature. It looked like a man, but taller, gaunt, with elongated limbs and glowing yellow eyes that seemed to burn into my soul. It moved unnaturally, limbs jerking and twitching as it took a step toward us. Maya grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "Close the tent," she hissed, and I did, my hands shaking. We huddled together, listening as the creature prowled around our campsite, the sound of its footsteps crunching through the underbrush. At one point, it stopped directly outside the tent, its shadow looming over us. I held my breath, waiting for it to leave, but it lingered like it was savoring our fear. Finally, after what felt like hours, the creature wandered away. We stayed up the rest of the night, too terrified to sleep, jumping at every rustle and creak in the forest. At dawn, we packed up and started down the trail, desperate to put distance between us and whatever had stalked us in the night. But after a few minutes of walking, we heard a familiar voice. "Leaving so soon?" We spun around to see Ranger Dean standing in the middle of the path, a twisted smile on his face. There was something off about him. His features seemed blurred, like they were shifting ever so slightly. And then, in a moment of horror, I realized why. His face wasn't his own. It was flickering, changing, almost like it was trying on different faces, different people. I blinked, and for a brief second, his face looked like mine. "You can't leave," he said, his voice now a chilling mimicry of my own. Without another word, we turned and ran, plunging through the forest, ignoring the paths and trails as we scrambled to escape. Branches whipped at my face and my lungs burned, but I didn't dare stop. Maya was right behind me, but no matter how fast we ran, I could hear the footsteps following us, getting closer and closer. Finally, we burst out of the trees and onto the road where we'd parked. We threw ourselves into the car, peeling out of there without looking back. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him, Ranger Dean, standing at the edge of the woods, his face contorting into that horrible, shifting mask. And then, with a sickening jolt, I realized I'd seen that face before. It wasn't just a park ranger, it was me. It was Maya. It was all the missing people he had ever hunted in these woods. We never spoke about what happened that night, but every time I close my eyes, I see him, feel him lurking in the shadows, waiting. I know now that the forest wasn't just a place, it was a trap, a hunting ground for something that could become anyone, anything, and it wore their faces like masks. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear him calling my name, whispering from just beyond the tree line. I thought camping alone would be a good way to clear my head. After a rough few months at work, I needed some time away, and I'd always loved the idea of being surrounded by nature, miles away from anyone else. So, I picked a spot deep in the Blackwood Forest where I knew I wouldn't be disturbed. It was remote, but not completely uncharted. A couple of old trails ran through it, and there were a few clearings I'd marked on my map. The first day went smoothly. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and made myself a small dinner over the fire. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest around me grew dark, but I was comforted by the warm glow of the fire. I sat there for a while, just listening to the crackling of the flames and the sounds of the forest. Crickets chirping, leaves rustling, the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, almost enough to make me forget about everything I'd left behind. But that peace didn't last. It was around midnight when I first heard it. A faint sound, like a whistle, drifting through the trees. I thought it might be the wind at first, but it was too deliberate, too melodic, almost like a tune. I stood up, peering into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything beyond the ring of light cast by my fire. I shook it off, telling myself it was probably just the wind. I went back to my tent, zipped it up tight, and lay there listening. The forest had gone quiet, unnaturally quiet. No more crickets, no more owls, just a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to press in around me. I strained my ears, trying to catch any hint of a sound, and that's when I heard it again. Closer this time, a low, mournful whistle that sent a shiver down my spine. I sat up, heart pounding, and reached for my flashlight. As I unzipped the tent, the sound stopped. I shone the light into the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating nothing but twisted branches and shadows. But then, at the edge of my light, I saw movement, a figure, just barely visible, standing between the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long, too thin. It didn't move, just stood there watching me. I felt a wave of fear, cold and paralyzing, but I forced myself to step out of the tent. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely more than a whisper. There was no response, just that awful silence, and then the figure disappeared, slipping back into the darkness like a shadow. I stood there for a moment listening, but there was nothing. No whistle, no footsteps. It was as if it had never been there at all. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was tired, that the shadows were playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I went back into the tent, leaving the flashlight on this time, and lay there staring at the ceiling, every nerve on edge. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I woke up sometime later to a strange sound, a low scratching noise, like something was dragging its claws along the side of the tent. I froze, my mind racing, as the sound moved around me, circling the tent. I held my breath, too terrified to move. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the scratching stopped. I waited, listening, but there was only silence. I thought about unzipping the tent, about shining my flashlight out into the darkness, but something inside me screamed not to. Instead, I huddled in my sleeping bag, eyes wide, heart racing, and waited for the dawn. When the first light crept through the fabric of the tent, I finally mustered the courage to go outside. I stepped out, half expecting to see claw marks in the dirt, but there was nothing. The campsite looked untouched, as if nothing had happened. I started to think I'd imagined it all, that maybe the solitude was getting to me. But then I noticed something strange. There were footprints around the tent, large, human-like, but with long, clawed toes. They circled the tent once, then led off into the trees. I followed them a short distance, heart pounding, but they disappeared after a few yards, as if whatever had made them had simply vanished. I went back to the campsite, packed up my things, and left. I didn't want to stay there another night, not with whatever had been lurking out there. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every so often I'd hear a faint whistle drifting through the trees, always just out of sight. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was the wind, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing closer, the shadows stretching longer. I walked faster, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps, and finally, I broke into a run, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the scratches on my arms or the branches tearing at my clothes. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the forest, my car a blessed sight in the early morning light. I scrambled inside, locked the doors, and drove, glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that tall, thin figure standing at the edge of the trees watching me. I never went back to that forest, but sometimes in the dead of night, I still hear that faint, mournful whistle drifting through the darkness. And I know that somewhere out there, something is watching, waiting, biding its time. And one day, it might come looking for me again. I'd always heard that the woods could be dangerous. People would say the forest hides things better left unseen, but I never believed it. Until that night. My best friend Jake and I decided to go camping in the backwoods of West Virginia, miles from any town or even a dirt road. Jake was a skeptic, a real prove-it kind of guy, and he dared me to spend the weekend in one of the most remote parts of the forest. We'd stocked up on supplies, loaded our packs, and made our way in, laughing off all the old tales about skinwalkers and dogmen. We figured they were just campfire stories. The first day was normal enough. We set up camp, found a decent clearing, and built a fire. We spent the afternoon exploring the surrounding forest, marveling at how thick and ancient it all looked. The trees stood like giants, their bark gnarled and twisted, and there was a strange quietness, an eerie absence of life. No birds, no squirrels, just us and the whisper of the wind through the branches. That night, as we sat around the fire, things began to feel off. It started with the noises. A low, guttural growl sounded from somewhere just beyond the firelight. Jake froze, staring into the darkness, but we couldn't see anything. We laughed it off nervously, assuming it was just some animal. But the noises kept coming. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, and every now and then, that growl. We'd shine our flashlights into the woods, but there was nothing there, only the black void of the forest. We tried to sleep, but I kept waking up. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear something moving closer. Around 3 a.m., I heard a scratching sound right outside my tent. I reached for my flashlight, heart pounding, and unzipped the tent. My light caught a glimpse of something moving, something on 2 legs, hunched and covered in dark fur. It slinked away before I could get a good look, but its silhouette looked wrong, twisted, like a man whose bones didn't fit together right. In the morning, we found strange footprints around the campsite. They were massive, almost human, but not quite. The toes were elongated, and they had claws at the ends. Jake was freaked out, but he didn't want to admit it. He brushed it off as a bear or a wolf, but I could tell he was shaken. We decided to hike deeper into the woods, thinking that maybe we'd find some trace of the creature, or at least some comfort in daylight. But as we walked, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees grew closer together, their branches tangling overhead, blotting out the sun. And then we found the carvings. Dozens of trees had symbols carved into their bark. Crude, almost ancient-looking glyphs that didn't match any language I'd seen before. Some of them looked like twisted faces. Others resembled animals or strange, unnatural shapes. There was something about them that made my skin crawl, like they were watching us. Jake was finally starting to feel the fear, too. I could see it in his eyes as he scanned the symbols, like he wanted to turn back but didn't want to seem scared. That night, the noises came back, but they were louder and closer. Something was moving just beyond the reach of the firelight. I could see shadows darting between the trees, and every now and then, a pair of glowing eyes would catch the light, staring at us with an intelligence that felt almost human. Then came the howls, long drawn-out wails that seemed to echo through the forest, getting closer and closer. Jake decided to go check it out. He grabbed his flashlight and walked toward the edge of the clearing, shouting into the darkness, demanding that whatever it was show itself. I wanted to stop him, but my legs felt like lead. I watched as he vanished into the shadows, his flashlight beam bobbing among the trees. Then the light went out, and everything went silent. I called his name, but there was no answer. I was alone, trapped in the clearing, surrounded by whatever lurked in the woods. Then in the distance I saw something moving, a figure, tall, lanky, with glowing eyes. It looked like Jake. But as it stepped closer, I saw its face, and it was wrong, twisted, elongated, like something was wearing his skin but hadn't quite figured out how to fit inside it. It moved toward me, its limbs jerking awkwardly like a puppet on broken strings. I stumbled back, falling onto the cold ground, and as it came closer, I saw that its eyes were empty, just hollow black pits. Then it spoke in Jake's voice, but distorted, like an echo of a memory. It said, "Come with us. Join us." I scrambled to my feet and ran. I didn't look back, not even when I heard it running after me, crashing through the underbrush with that unnatural gait. I don't remember much of the run back, only that I kept moving, fueled by pure terror. When I finally burst out of the woods, the sun was rising, and I was alone. I went back with a search party the next day, but there was no trace of Jake, no campsite, no footprints, nothing. The trees stood silent and unyielding, as if they'd swallowed him whole. I told them what I saw, but they didn't believe me. They said he must have gotten lost, maybe fell into a ravine or ran off. But I know the truth. He didn't run. Something took him, something that wears the faces of those it claims. And now sometimes late at night I hear his voice outside my window, calling my name, telling me to come back to the woods. But I won't. I know better now. Some things in the forest are better left unseen. I had planned this trip for months, a solo backpacking journey deep into the forest, a place where no trails existed, where the trees grew thick and wild. The ranger I checked in with gave me an odd look, his face pale beneath his hat. "You sure you want to go out there alone?" he asked. "Folks sometimes come back saying they saw things that don't make sense." I laughed it off, told him I'd be fine, but his warning lingered as I made my way into the forest, the sounds of civilization fading with each step. By the time I set up my tent that night, I was surrounded by an eerie silence that felt almost expectant. It wasn't until the third night that things took a turn. By then, I was miles from any road, far from where anyone would look if something went wrong. It was around midnight when I heard it. A distant cry, long and mournful, like a human scream twisted into something inhuman. It echoed through the trees, sending a shiver down my spine. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, but I'd never heard anything like it before. I lay awake for hours, listening. Eventually, I heard footsteps. At first, they were soft, cautious, but they grew closer, louder, until they stopped just outside my tent. I held my breath, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. And then there was a scratching, light at first, but insistent, like something testing the fabric, looking for a way inside. I didn't dare move. I waited silent, hoping it would go away. Eventually, the scratching stopped and I heard the footsteps retreat, fading into the night. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching my knife, every sense alert. The next morning, I found strange tracks around my tent. They looked almost like hoof prints, but larger, deeper, with strange claw-like imprints around them. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me, sizing me up. I debated heading back, but pride and curiosity kept me moving forward. I wanted to know what was out here. That evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, I came across a clearing. In the center stood a massive tree, its trunk scarred with strange symbols carved deep into the bark. They looked ancient, like something you'd see in a museum, but more unsettling, almost like they were alive. I felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to run, but I couldn't look away. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw a movement, a shadow, flitting between the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its limbs seemed to bend in ways that defied nature. I caught a glimpse of its face, a hollow, expressionless mask with empty eye sockets that seemed to stare right into my soul. My heart raced, and I backed away, desperate to put distance between myself and that thing. I set up camp as far from the clearing as I could manage, but the forest felt different now, oppressive, like the trees were closing in around me. That night I heard the crying again, closer this time. It didn't sound like an animal or a person. It was something else, something wrong. I lay in my tent, clutching my flashlight, when I heard it again, the footsteps circling me, slow and deliberate, as if whatever was out there was playing with me. And then the crying changed. It became a laugh, low, guttural, echoing around me, coming from all directions at once. I shot up, stumbling out of my tent, my flashlight sweeping the darkness. I saw nothing but trees, shadows twisting in the light. And then I saw it, the creature, standing at the edge of the trees, its face now contorted into a grotesque smile, its eyes dark and endless. It lifted a hand, and I saw long, bony fingers extending toward me, beckoning. I ran. I don't know how far or how long, but I ran until my legs gave out, until I collapsed, gasping for air, my flashlight flickering as it hit the ground. When I looked up, I was surrounded, not by trees, but by figures tall and thin, their faces identical to the thing that had been stalking me. They stared down at me, their mouths stretching into unnatural grins, and I realized with horror that they had no eyes, just empty, black voids. I scrambled backward, but they didn't follow. They just watched, as if waiting for something. And then, one by one, they began to hum, a low, vibrating sound that filled the air, resonating in my bones. It grew louder and louder, until it felt like my skull would shatter. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't stop. I could feel it inside me, twisting, reshaping. Then, everything went black. When I woke up, it was morning. The figures were gone, the forest silent once again. I scrambled to my feet, disoriented, desperate to find my way out. As I staggered through the trees, I caught sight of my reflection in a small stream, and my blood ran cold. My face was pale, my eyes hollow like the creatures I'd seen. I touched my skin, and it felt cold, like I was wearing a mask. I stumbled back, terrified, as I heard a familiar sound echoing through the forest, the sound of footsteps, of crying, of laughter. And then I understood. I hadn't escaped. I had become one of them. Now I wander these woods, a shadow among shadows, searching for the next lost soul to join us. And if you ever find yourself deep in the forest, far from the trail, you might just hear me. And if you do, it's already too late. It's funny how we go looking for adventure in places we think we understand. That was my first mistake. If I'd known what was waiting for me in those woods, I'd have never taken that job. But it's too late for regrets now. It started last summer when I picked up a gig as a seasonal park ranger in a small, obscure park out in Colorado. The place was a well-kept secret, rarely visited by tourists, and honestly, I thought I'd be dealing with little more than lonely hikers and the occasional lost camper. I couldn't have been more wrong. I got the late shift on my first night. Lucky me, right? My supervisor, an old-timer named Bill, gave me a flashlight, a radio, and a beat-up map of the trails. "Stay on the main path, stick to the marked trails," he said, his voice gravely serious. "And if you hear anything strange, ignore it." "Strange like what?" I asked, thinking he was just trying to mess with the new guy. He didn't answer, just gave me a look that was somewhere between pity and fear. "Just stay on the trail," he repeated, then turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the station as the sun dipped below the horizon. So I set off, following the dirt path that wound through the thick forest. As the last light faded, the woods became a maze of shadows, and I found myself jumping at every little sound: the snap of a twig, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. It was unnerving, but I tried to shrug it off. This was my job, after all. I couldn't let my imagination get the better of me. About an hour into my patrol, I started hearing something else. At first, it was just a soft whisper, barely audible over the rustling leaves. I paused, straining to listen, but it was gone. Probably the wind, I told myself, though the excuse felt hollow. I kept walking, but the whispering grew louder, more insistent. It was all around me now, weaving through the trees like some kind of twisted melody. I couldn't make out any words, just a low, rhythmic murmur that seemed to pulse with the beating of my heart. I tried to radio Bill, but all I got was static. My flashlight flickered, and a wave of cold air washed over me. I looked around, suddenly aware that I had no idea where I was. The trail markers were gone, and the trees seemed to close in around me, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I was about to turn back when I saw something ahead, a faint light, bobbing through the trees. Relief flooded through me. Another ranger, maybe, or a late-night hiker. I called out, but the light didn't stop. It just kept moving, weaving through the forest like it was leading me somewhere. Against my better judgment, I followed it. I don't know why. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I was just desperate for some sign of civilization. The light led me deeper into the woods, winding through narrow paths and over fallen logs until I found myself in a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was a fire pit, surrounded by a circle of old weathered stones. The fire was out, but the embers were still glowing, casting an eerie red light across the clearing. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw them. Footprints, dozens of them circling the fire pit in a chaotic pattern. Some were human, but others looked like animal tracks, deep and clawed, unlike anything I'd ever seen. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized the tracks didn't just circle the pit, they led away from it, disappearing into the trees on the other side of the clearing. I wanted to turn back, to run, but something compelled me to follow. I took a step forward, then another, my feet sinking into the damp earth as I moved toward the edge of the clearing. And that's when I saw her. She was standing just beyond the tree line, half hidden in shadow. Her back was to me, but I could see enough to know that something was very, very wrong. Her limbs were too long, her movements too fluid, like she was made of water instead of flesh and bone. Her head was cocked at an unnatural angle, and her skin was pale, almost translucent, glowing faintly in the dim light. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. She turned, her face coming into view, and I felt my stomach drop. Her eyes were empty, hollow sockets that seemed to stare right through me. She opened her mouth, and a low guttural sound escaped her lips like the growl of some wild animal. I stumbled back, tripping over a root and landing hard on the ground. The woman, or whatever she was, took a step toward me, her limbs twisting and contorting in ways that should have been impossible. I scrambled to my feet, but she was already there, her face inches from mine. And then she spoke. Her voice was a whisper, soft and cold, but I could understand the words. "Help me," she said, her empty eyes locking onto mine. "Help me find my face." I bolted, running through the trees, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was back at the ranger station, my lungs burning and my mind racing. Bill was there, waiting for me, his face pale. "You saw her, didn't you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded, too shaken to speak. He sighed, shaking his head. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last." I quit the next day, packed up my things, and left that park without looking back. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, an overactive imagination. But sometimes, late at night, I hear her voice again, whispering through the darkness, asking me to help her find her face. And I know that somehow, some way, she's still out there, waiting in the shadows. I've worked as a park ranger for 5 years, patrolling a vast stretch of dense forest in the Pacific Northwest. I'm used to the solitude, the sounds of nature, the occasional lost hiker. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened during one late fall night, something I can barely comprehend, let alone explain. It started out like any other evening. My shift had me stationed near the Timberlake campsite, a remote area accessible only by a narrow dirt road. A group of campers had checked in that afternoon, and I was tasked with keeping an eye on things. As night fell, the woods became eerily silent, with only the occasional crackle of a fire in the distance reminding me that I wasn't completely alone. Around 10 p.m., I decided to take a walk through the woods, flashlight in hand. The towering pines loomed over me like silent sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The trail was familiar, yet there was something off. The usual nocturnal sounds, chirping insects, hooting owls, had faded. The deeper I ventured into the forest, the more suffocating the silence became. I stopped for a moment, listening. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl, so faint it could have been mistaken for the wind. But I knew better. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but curiosity got the better of me. I pointed my flashlight in the direction of the sound, but the beam barely penetrated the inky darkness. "Hello?" I called out, trying to sound more confident than I felt. No response, just the heavy rustling of leaves, almost as if something was circling me, hidden just beyond the trees. I forced myself to move forward, my grip tightening on the flashlight, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The growl came again, this time louder and closer, echoing in the stillness. My pulse quickened. Whatever was making that noise wasn't any animal I'd ever encountered. Suddenly, a sharp snap, a branch breaking behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but saw nothing, just more trees, more shadow. I tried to reassure myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. But as I scanned the woods, my flashlight flickered. The beam sputtered, dimmed, and finally died, plunging me into darkness. Panic surged through me. I fumbled for my radio, but before I could get it out, something crashed through the underbrush ahead. My eyes strained against the black, and that's when I saw it. 2 glowing, yellow eyes staring back at me from between the trees. They blinked slowly, the creature staying perfectly still. I was frozen, my mind unable to process what I was looking at. Those eyes were too high off the ground for a wolf, and the shape, hulking, distorted, was all wrong for a bear. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as the creature stepped forward, its massive form emerging from the shadows. It was a towering, hunched figure, its limbs elongated and twisted unnaturally. The skin or fur, whatever it had, looked mangy, sickly, and it reeked of decay. I backed up slowly, my hands trembling, but it followed, closing the distance between us with unsettling ease. As it drew closer, I could make out more details. Long, clawed hands, a snout like that of a dog, but grotesque, wrong. The creature let out a low, rattling breath, and I realized it wasn't just watching me. It was studying me. Suddenly, my radio crackled to life, breaking the silence with a burst of static. "Ranger Smith, are you there? We've got reports of..." The voice was cut off as the creature lunged. I bolted, crashing through the trees, my feet barely touching the ground. Behind me, I heard the thing give chase, its heavy footsteps pounding the earth. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't dare look back. The sound of its growling breath grew closer, filling my ears, drowning out everything else. I don't know how far I ran, but eventually the growls faded. I found myself near the camper's site, gasping for breath. The group was still gathered around the fire, laughing, completely unaware of the nightmare lurking just beyond the tree line. "Something's out there," I shouted, my voice ragged, but they just stared at me, confused. Before I could explain, I heard a noise. Footsteps, but not from the creature. A figure emerged from the woods, another park ranger, but something about him was off. His uniform looked worn, old. His face was obscured by shadow, and when he spoke, his voice was eerily calm. "You shouldn't be out here," he said. "Not tonight." I blinked in confusion. Who are you?" "I've been here a long time," he replied, stepping closer. His eyes, they were the same sickly yellow as the creature's. "You've seen too much. Time to go." Before I could react, everything went black. I woke up the next morning in my cabin, drenched in sweat. My radio was on the floor, and the door was locked from the inside. No sign of a struggle, no claw marks, no tracks outside. It was as if nothing had happened. But when I checked in with the other rangers, they told me something chilling. There haven't been campers at Timberlake in over a year. The area's been closed off after several disappearances. And that ranger, he died decades ago. Now, every time I go into the woods, I can feel it, that thing, watching me from the trees, waiting. I don't know what's real anymore. Was it all a hallucination, a nightmare? Or is there something far worse lurking in the deep, dark woods? Whatever it is, I'm not sure I'll survive if it finds me again. The forest never forgets, and neither will I. I'd been on countless solo camping trips before, but nothing like this. This time, I wanted isolation, a real chance to escape. So I picked the deepest corner of the Wrenwood National Forest, far from any established trail. They say the forest is ancient, that it's seen things most people would never believe. I thought it was just local lore to keep tourists from wandering off. Now, I know better. I arrived at dusk, parking my truck at the edge of a dirt road and setting off with just my pack and flashlight. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating, but I relished it. As I trekked through the underbrush, I caught glimpses of old park signs, weathered and broken, barely visible beneath the moss and vines. They hadn't maintained this area in years. Perfect. I found a small clearing surrounded by towering pines and set up my tent. The forest was unusually quiet, but I chalked it up to being so far out. No people, no noise. But as I sat by my campfire, the woods felt different, somehow. Off. The shadows seemed to stretch too far, creeping toward me like they were alive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. But every time I turned around, there was nothing there. It started around midnight. I was lying in my tent on the edge of sleep when I heard footsteps. Soft, almost careful, as if whoever was out there didn't want to be heard. I sat up, holding my breath, and strained to listen. The footsteps stopped. Then just outside my tent I heard a low, guttural breathing. Something big was there, sniffing around, circling. I stayed completely still, barely daring to breathe. My mind raced through explanations. A bear, maybe a wolf. But then it made a sound, a deep, rumbling growl that was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It was a sound that didn't belong in these woods or anywhere else I knew of. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on, ready to scare off whatever was out there. But when I unzipped the tent and shined the beam into the darkness, there was nothing, just empty forest, stretching into blackness. The next morning I found tracks around my campsite. They looked almost human, but elongated, as if someone had taken human feet and stretched them, with claw marks at the tips of each toe. My stomach twisted as I followed them, each step leading further into the dense trees. But then the tracks just stopped. There were no other prints, no sign of the creature. It was as if it had vanished. I decided to pack up and leave, but as I turned to go, I noticed something strange. A small, carved totem lying in the dirt. It was crude, a roughly carved figure with hollow eyes and an open mouth, like it was screaming. I picked it up, shivering as I felt a chill run down my spine. Suddenly, a voice echoed behind me, low and whispering, like the wind had turned into words. "You're not supposed to be here." I spun around, but there was no one there. The forest was still, almost too still, as if it were holding its breath. I shoved the totem into my pocket, quickened my pace, and headed back the way I'd come. But after what felt like an hour of walking, I realized I was completely lost. No matter which way I went, the trees seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting and contorting in ways that made me dizzy. As the sun began to set, I stumbled upon an old cabin hidden in a thick grove of trees. It was decrepit, with broken windows and a sagging roof. Desperation clawed at me. I needed shelter, any shelter. I pushed the door open and the stench hit me immediately, a foul, rotting smell like something long dead. The cabin's walls were covered in strange symbols carved deep into the wood. They looked like ancient runes or warnings. And then I saw them, scattered on the floor, piles of animal bones, all arranged in odd patterns. My pulse quickened and I backed away, but then I heard footsteps again, this time inside the cabin. I turned and there it was, a creature standing in the doorway blocking my escape. It was tall, with limbs too long for its body and skin stretched tight over sharp bones. Its face was wrong, like it was trying to mimic a human expression but couldn't quite get it right. Its mouth opened, and the same raspy whisper came out, "You're not supposed to be here." I stumbled back, heart racing, as the creature lunged forward. I scrambled out through a broken window, not caring about the cuts and scrapes as I tore through the forest, desperate to escape. The creature followed, its steps slow and methodical, as if it knew I couldn't get away. The forest seemed to twist around me, and I was running in circles, seeing the same trees, the same boulders, over and over again. Finally, I burst into the clearing where I'd left my truck. I didn't look back as I jumped in, started the engine, and sped down the dirt road. As I drove, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching, its hollow eyes fixed on me. I didn't stop until I was miles away, but when I finally pulled over to catch my breath, I felt something in my pocket. The totem. I pulled it out, my hands trembling. But it wasn't the same as before. Now, the carved face looked just like mine, hollow eyes and a mouth stretched in a silent scream. The realization hit me with a sickening dread. I haven't been back to Wrenwood since, but I know that thing is still out there. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear it, whispering from the shadows, reminding me that I was never supposed to leave. When I was a kid, I used to spend summers at my uncle's cabin deep in the Appalachian woods. It was miles from the nearest town, surrounded by thick trees and endless trails. The locals called it Devil's Hollow, a name I laughed off back then. I figured it was just one of those names like Skull Rock or Dead Man's Creek, meant to scare off city folk. But that summer, I learned just how real Devil's Hollow could be. It was my last night before heading back to civilization. I decided to go for a hike to my favorite spot, a small, rocky overlook where you could see the stars stretching out over the mountains. The air was thick and humid, buzzing with the sounds of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. I set off just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the forest in a dim, amber glow. As I walked, the usual forest sounds began to fade, replaced by an uneasy quiet that wrapped itself around me like a shroud. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the approaching night, but there was something unsettling in the silence. The trees felt closer than usual, their twisted branches clawing at the sky, and the underbrush was thick and unyielding, as if the forest itself was trying to keep me out. I finally reached the overlook, but the view wasn't the same. The trees seemed to close in around the edge, obscuring the stars and trapping the last light of the day. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned, scanning the woods, but there was nothing, just shadows dancing at the edge of my vision. And then I heard it. A rustling sound, low and rhythmic, like something big moving through the trees. My heart started to race. The first thought that crossed my mind was a bear, but this was different. Bears didn't sound like that. This was slow, deliberate, each step heavy and calculated. I held my breath, listening, straining to hear past the pounding of my own heartbeat. A shape moved in the darkness. It was too far to make out clearly, but it was tall, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch impossibly high. I blinked, and it was gone, melting back into the shadows as if it had never been there at all. I laughed nervously, telling myself it was just a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew better. I started back down the trail, walking faster than I'd like to admit. The night was closing in fast, and with it came a deep, bone-chilling cold that didn't belong in the middle of summer. I could see my breath misting in the air, hanging like a ghostly fog that clung to the trees. The forest was silent now, unnaturally so, as if every living thing had gone still, waiting for something. That's when I heard the voice. At first it was faint, barely more than a whisper carried on the wind, but it grew louder, stronger, until it was echoing around me, bouncing off the trees in a way that made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. It was a woman's voice, soft and pleading, calling my name in a way that made my skin crawl. I knew it couldn't be real. I was alone out here. No one knew I'd gone for a hike. But the voice kept calling, insistent, desperate, drawing me deeper into the woods. I turned in circles, trying to find the source, but there was nothing there, just the trees, looming like silent sentinels, watching me with eyes I couldn't see. I tried to tell myself to keep moving, to get back to the cabin, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. The voice came again, closer this time, dripping with a sweetness that felt wrong, like honey laced with poison. And then I saw her. She stood just off the trail, half hidden by the shadows, but I could see enough to know she wasn't right. Her limbs were too long, bending at odd angles, and her skin was pale and stretched tight over her bones, almost translucent in the moonlight. Her face was wrong too, distorted, with eyes that were too big, too dark, and a mouth that stretched into a too wide smile. She tilted her head, staring at me with an expression that was almost curious, like she was studying me, waiting to see what I would do. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from her. The forest seemed to close in around me, the branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, snagging my clothes and scratching at my skin. I could hear her behind me, that horrible, unnatural voice calling my name, over and over, each time closer than the last. Somehow I made it back to the cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. I pressed my back against the door, gasping for breath, listening for any sign that she'd followed me. But there was nothing. Just silence. I stayed up the rest of the night, clutching a flashlight and watching the windows, waiting for the first light of dawn. When the sun finally rose, I packed my things and left, not even stopping to say goodbye to my uncle. I never told him what happened, and I never went back to Devil's Hollow. Sometimes late at night, I'll hear a voice calling my name, soft and sweet, like the whisper of the wind through the trees. I tell myself it's just my imagination, just a memory lingering in the back of my mind. But deep down, I know better. The woods remember, and they're always waiting. I've always loved camping. Growing up, my dad used to take me out to the woods every summer, and we'd spend the weekend fishing, hiking, and roasting marshmallows by the fire. So, when a few buddies invited me out for a weekend camping trip in the mountains, I jumped at the chance. It was supposed to be a guys' trip, a reunion of sorts since we hadn't all been together in years. There were 4 of us, me, Dave, Matt, and Lucas. We picked a spot deep in the Appalachian Mountains, far from any towns or cell reception. The perfect place to disconnect. When we arrived, the site was everything you'd want in a remote camping spot. Dense trees, a small clearing for our tents, and a stream nearby for water. But as soon as we set up camp, something felt off. At first it was small things. The air felt heavier than it should. The wind carried strange, almost rhythmic sounds, and the woods around us seemed too quiet. No birds, no insects, just the occasional rustle of leaves that felt too purposeful to be random. We all noticed it but brushed it off. It was probably just our minds playing tricks on us, we told ourselves. Still, by the time night fell and we were sitting around the fire, drinking and swapping stories, there was an undercurrent of unease none of us could shake. That's when we heard it, a distant low wail. It was faint, like a moan carried on the wind, but it made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I looked at the others, and they'd heard it too. Dave, always the skeptic, waved it off as some animal. Mountain lions or some shit, he said with a shrug, though even he didn't sound convinced. But it wasn't just once. The sound came again, louder this time, closer. A long, drawn-out wail that echoed through the trees. We all fell silent, listening, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. It sounded human. Lucas, the most experienced hiker among us, stood up and grabbed his flashlight. "I'm going to check it out," he said, pointing it toward the direction of the sound. Matt and I looked at each other, hesitant. "Man, are you sure that's a good idea?" I asked. But Lucas was already heading into the woods. We watched his light bob through the trees until it disappeared completely. The minutes dragged on. 5 minutes. 10. The wailing stopped, and now we were sitting in complete silence. The longer he was gone, the more uneasy I felt. Something wasn't right. After what felt like an eternity, the wailing returned, this time louder, as if it were right outside the camp. But something was different. It wasn't just a cry. There was a strange, mocking tone to it, like it was imitating the sound rather than making it. Suddenly, Lucas's light appeared again in the distance. We breathed a sigh of relief as he stumbled back into camp, looking pale and shaken. "You find anything?" Dave asked, but Lucas didn't respond. He just stared at us, his eyes wide, his face drawn. "Lucas," Matt tried, his voice low and uncertain. And then Lucas smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far across his face. Something about it was wrong, horribly wrong. The firelight flickered across his features, casting strange shadows, and for a split second it looked like his face was shifting, as if his features weren't entirely fixed. "Where did you go?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Lucas, or whatever was standing there, tilted his head, still grinning, and said in a voice that wasn't his, "I never left." The chill that ran through me was like ice water down my spine. That wasn't Lucas's voice. It was too deep, too distorted, like someone was trying to mimic him but couldn't quite get it right. I stood up, backing away slowly. What the hell is going on? "Sit down, man," Dave said, his voice cracking. "Stop messing around, Lucas." But Lucas, or whatever was wearing his face, just kept smiling. Then he turned and walked toward the edge of the woods, back into the darkness without another word. We didn't follow. We didn't dare. Dave tried to rationalize it. Maybe Lucas was just messing with us. Maybe he was playing some elaborate prank. But deep down, we all knew something was horribly wrong. An hour passed. Then 2. We sat around the fire, gripping our flashlights and knives, listening for any sign of movement. Every so often we'd hear that wail again, closer, further, circling us like something was toying with us. Eventually we couldn't take it anymore. "We need to get out of here," Matt said, his voice shaking. We packed up in a rush, barely bothering to roll up the tents, and started heading toward the trailhead. But the deeper we went into the woods, the more lost we felt. None of the landmarks looked familiar. It was like the forest had shifted, rearranged itself to confuse us. As the hours dragged on, panic set in. It felt like we were walking in circles. but every time we tried to turn back, we'd end up somewhere else, deeper into the woods, further from any hope of escape. That's when we saw it. Standing at the edge of our flashlight beams was Lucas, or at least it looked like him. But his face was wrong. The skin hung loose like it didn't quite fit. His eyes were too wide, too dark. And that smile. God, that smile. He spoke, but it wasn't his voice. It was that same distorted, mocking tone from earlier. I told you, I never left. Before any of us could react, he or it vanished into the trees again, swallowed by the darkness. We ran. We didn't stop until the first light of dawn broke through the canopy, and even then, it took us hours to find the trailhead. We never found Lucas. Days later, search teams combed the area, but they didn't find a trace of him either. The official story was that he got lost, that maybe he fell or was taken by a predator. But we knew the truth. Or at least we thought we did. Sometimes late at night I hear that wail again. Faint, just at the edge of my hearing, like it's calling to me. And when I do, I think about Lucas. I think about whatever it was that came back in his place. I don't know what compelled me to take that solo camping trip. Maybe it was stress, maybe it was the need to prove something to myself. I'd always liked the outdoors, but this time felt different. I wasn't seeking the usual escape or connection with nature. No, this was more like I was running from something, or running toward it. I chose a remote campsite deep in the forest, far from any main trails. One of those places you wouldn't know about unless you'd been there before, or someone had told you in a hushed, almost secretive way. It had a reputation, but not the kind people talked about openly. Some called it Whispering Pines. Others didn't call it anything at all. The drive up was uneventful, though the roads became narrower and more overgrown the closer I got to the site. By the time I arrived, the sun was already beginning to sink behind the trees, casting long, golden shadows across the forest floor. I set up my tent quickly, eager to get a fire going before it got too dark. The first couple of hours were peaceful enough. The woods were dense, the air cool and damp. There was something different about the atmosphere here, though. The silence was thick, almost oppressive. Not the usual peaceful quiet of the forest, but more like a void, like the world had been muted. The birds weren't singing, no rustle of small animals in the brush, just nothing. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that I was just jittery from being alone. I stoked the fire, cooking a simple dinner and watching the flames dance as night fell. The firelight felt like a bubble of warmth and safety, and I was reluctant to leave its glow even for a moment. But then the wind picked up. It wasn't much at first, just a gentle breeze that made the trees sway. Then it started to get stronger, and with it came a sound, a soft, low moaning. I told myself it was the wind, that it was just the trees bending and creaking, but there was something almost human about it, like someone whispering from just out of sight. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the fire, but that uneasy feeling only grew. The temperature seemed to drop unnaturally fast, and soon the air was so cold that I could see my breath hanging in the air. The fire, which had been burning brightly, seemed to dim, as if the darkness was swallowing it whole. Then the footsteps started. They were distant at first, faint, like someone or something was moving just beyond the ring of light from my campfire. I whipped around, shining my flashlight into the trees, but all I could see were thick shadows, the forest stretching endlessly in every direction. No sign of anyone. I told myself it was just animals, maybe deer or raccoons, but the footsteps were too deliberate, too steady, like someone walking slowly, methodically, just out of sight. "Hello?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is someone out there?" The footsteps stopped. The silence returned, thicker than before, pressing in on me from all sides. I strained to listen, but there was nothing. I sat back down, trying to calm my nerves. I'd heard stories of people getting paranoid in the woods, their minds playing tricks on them. Maybe that's what was happening to me. It had to be, right? The footsteps started again, closer this time. I stood up, heart pounding in my chest, gripping the flashlight tighter. I swept the beam across the trees, looking for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just the endless sea of black shadows and towering pines. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something, a figure standing just at the edge of the light. I swung the flashlight toward it, but it was gone. My pulse quickened as I spun around, scanning the tree line. That's when I noticed something strange about the trees themselves. At first I couldn't quite place it, but then it hit me. The trees had shifted. They weren't in the same place they had been when I set up camp. Some were closer now, leaning in toward the fire as though they were watching me. I swallowed hard, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. I backed up slowly, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing in, as if the forest itself was alive, shifting, changing. And then I heard the voice. At first it was barely more than a breath, a soft whisper carried on the wind. "Leave." I froze, the word cutting through the silence like a knife. My heart was racing now, and I felt cold sweat trickling down the back of my neck. The voice wasn't loud, but it was close, so close that I could almost feel it against my skin. "Leave." This time it was clearer, more distinct. I whipped the flashlight around, desperately searching for the source, but there was no one there. I grabbed my backpack, barely bothering to stuff my things inside, my mind screaming at me to get out of there. I kicked dirt over the fire, trying to douse the flames, but as I did, I noticed something strange. The ground where I had been sitting all night was covered in symbols, crudely drawn circles and spirals, etched into the dirt like some kind of ancient script. I didn't do that. I hadn't touched the ground. The whispering grew louder, overlapping now, coming from all directions. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was many, all speaking in that same breathless tone. "Leave. Leave. Leave." I ran. I didn't care where I was going as long as it was away from that campsite. My flashlight bounced wildly in front of me as I stumbled through the trees, branches whipping at my face, the voices still echoing behind me. I could feel something chasing me, though I didn't dare look back. I burst out onto the narrow trail, my lungs burning, my legs shaking. I had no idea how far I had run, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Not until I reached my car. When I finally did, I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling so badly I almost dropped them. The whispers had stopped now, but the forest was still watching. I could feel it. As I sped down the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. That's when I saw it. In the faint reflection just beyond the trees, I caught a glimpse of something moving. A figure, tall and shadowy, standing in the middle of the trail, watching me as I drove away. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down, and I haven't been back since. But sometimes at night, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can still hear it. The whispering, telling me I should have never left. Because the forest never forgets.